Hampton Court Palace in 1530 employed somewhere between 800 and 1,200 servants, depending on whether you count the seasonal staff, the hangers-on, and the category of person who had secured a place at court through connection rather than function, and whose precise role nobody had satisfactorily defined. Among these servants was a man whose entire professional obligation consisted of handing the king a towel after he washed his hands. There was another man whose job was to taste the king's food before the king ate it, a role we have discussed elsewhere, and one that carried its own particular anxieties. There was a man responsible for the king's dogs, a man responsible for carrying the king's chair, a man whose function was to be present whenever the king walked from one room to another, in case the king required something that none of the other men walking with the king were specifically authorized to provide. All of these men received wages, accommodation, food, and livery. All of them considered their positions desirable. None of them, with the possible exception of the food taster, would have described their work as dangerous. Several of them were wrong about this. This is a video about what your day as a Tudor servant at Hampton Court in 1530 actually looked like. Not the version from the television dramas where the servants are atmospheric background figures who occasionally deliver messages and look appropriately worried, but the version where the palace was a functioning city of over 1,000 people, governed by a document called the Eltham Ordinances, that specified in exhaustive detail what every category of servant was permitted to eat, where they were permitted to sleep, and what happened to them if they were found somewhere in the palace they were not supposed to be. You have a position, you have a livery. You have a role so specific that it has a name derived from the Norman French that has not changed in 200 years. You are about to discover that working for the most powerful man in England is considerably less glamorous than it sounds, and considerably more dangerous than it looks. First, you need to understand what Hampton Court actually was in 1530, because the palace that exists in the popular imagination, the red brick building with the famous maze and the ghost of Catherine Howard, is largely the Hampton Court that Henry built after 1530, during the years when he was actively expanding and rebuilding the palace that Cardinal Wolsey had given him in 1525. In 1530, Hampton Court was a palace in the process of becoming what it would eventually be, already enormous by any standard that did not involve comparison with Versailles, already housing a court of extraordinary complexity and expense, and already subject to the document that governed every aspect of its internal life with a thoroughness that suggests whoever wrote it had given considerable thought to what happens when you put 1,000 people of varying social status, political ambition, and personal animosity into a confined space and tell them all to serve the same master. The Eltham Ordinances of 1526 were issued by Cardinal Wolsey, then at the height of his power as Henry's Lord Chancellor, and they represent one of the most detailed administrative documents produced by the Tudor court. A comprehensive attempt to regulate the size, cost, and behavior of the royal household, by specifying exactly how many servants each officer of the court was permitted to maintain, what each category of servant was entitled to receive in wages and food, and what conduct was expected of everyone from the Lord Chamberlain to the children of the kitchen. The ordinances reduced the household from a sprawling accumulation of several thousand people to a more manageable establishment. The reduction was relative, since several hundred servants remained after the cuts, and they introduced a degree of administrative order that the palace had previously lacked. They did not, as a practical matter, make working in the palace significantly easier, more comfortable, or less politically hazardous. They simply made the conditions under which these things were not easier, comfortable, or safe considerably more precisely documented. Your day at Hampton Court begins before dawn, because the palace day begins before dawn. And your role in the palace day begins earlier than the roles of the people you serve, who themselves begin earlier than the roles of the people they serve, in a cascade of early rising that works its way up the hierarchy until it reaches the king, who is also up early, but whose early rising is attended by considerably more ceremony and considerably better breakfast. You are, depending on your specific position, either in the kitchens, stoking fires and preparing the first meal of the day, or in the chambers making beds and emptying chamber pots, or in the great hall setting tables, or in the stables attending to horses, or in one of the dozens of other specialized functions that the palace required to be operational by the time the king's day officially began. The palace kitchens at Hampton Court were, in 1530, among the largest and most complex food production facilities in England. A series of rooms covering several thousand square feet and staffed by a hierarchy of cooks, undercooks, scullions and kitchen boys, whose internal organization was almost as elaborate as the court hierarchy above them. The great kitchen produced 2 meals a day for the entire household, dinner at midday and supper in the evening, supplemented by the privy kitchen that produced the king's personal meals to separate standards of preparation and security. The quantity of food consumed at Hampton Court was staggering by any ordinary measure. The household accounts record the consumption of hundreds of oxen, thousands of sheep, tens of thousands of birds, and quantities of wine, ale, and beer that suggest the Tudors took seriously their obligation to keep a large workforce adequately hydrated, if not precisely sober. The kitchen staff who produced this output worked in conditions of intense heat, noise, and hierarchical pressure that made the Great Hall, with its airs and its elaborate service rituals, seem tranquil by comparison. The kitchens were where the work actually happened. The hall was where the performance of the work was displayed. The two were not the same experience. Now we need to talk about the Groom of the Stool, because the Groom of the Stool is the detail that every account of Tudor court life eventually arrives at, and with good reason. It is the position that most efficiently illustrates the central paradox of court service, which is that proximity to power is power, and proximity to power in its most intimate and undignified manifestations is, counterintuitively, the most powerful proximity of all. The Groom of the Stool, the title derived from the close stool, a portable toilet used by the king, was the officer responsible for attending the king during his private bodily functions. The position involved handing the king implements for personal hygiene, assisting with dressing and undressing, and in general being present during the moments of the king's day that were most completely private, and therefore, in the economy of a court where access to the king was the primary currency of political influence, most completely valuable. The men who held the position of Groom of the Stool under Henry VIII were not minor figures. Sir William Compton, who held the position in the early years of Henry's reign, was one of the king's closest companions and one of the wealthiest men in England. Sir Henry Norris, who held it later, was executed in 1536 on charges of adultery with Anne Boleyn, charges that were almost certainly fabricated, but whose fabrication required him to be a figure of sufficient importance that his destruction served a political purpose. The Groom of the Stool had daily, unsupervised access to the king at the moments when the king was most relaxed, most candid, and most susceptible to personal influence. Every ambitious nobleman at court understood this. The position was sought, it was competed for. It was, in the political arithmetic of the Tudor court, worth considerably more than its title suggested, which is a sentence that requires the reader to do a certain amount of work to fully appreciate. The hierarchy of the Tudor court was not simply a ranking of importance, it was a physical geography. The palace was organized as a series of rooms of increasing exclusivity, and your right to be present in each room defined your political position with a precision that made the modern organizational chart look vague by comparison. The outermost rooms, the Great Hall, the Great Watching Chamber, were accessible to anyone with legitimate business at court, which in practice meant a fairly large number of people, including petitioners, merchants, ambassadors' retinues, and the lower grades of household servants. As you moved inward, the rooms became smaller, the company more select, and the gatekeeping more rigorous. The presence chamber was where the king received formal visitors and conducted public business. The privy chamber was where the king spent his private time, accessible only to the gentlemen of the privy chamber, a select group of noblemen and senior courtiers who rotated through shifts of attendance and whose access to the privy chamber was the most tangible marker of their favour with the king. Beyond the privy chamber was the bedchamber, accessible to an even smaller group, and beyond that, the study and the private closet, where the king prayed, worked, and was most himself, attended only by the most intimate body servants. Your position in this geography was fixed, enforced, and a matter of continuous anxiety. The rules about who could enter which rooms were written down in the Eltham Ordinances and reinforced by the gentlemen ushers, officers whose specific function was to control access to each successive room and to eject people who had no business being where they were found. Being found in a room above your station was not merely embarrassing, it was a matter of potential official consequence, particularly in a court where suspicion of inappropriate access to the king could be interpreted as evidence of inappropriate influence over the king, which in the paranoid political atmosphere of Henry's court could shade fairly quickly into charges considerably more serious than a breach of household protocol. People at Hampton Court were careful about which rooms they entered. They were more careful than is entirely comfortable to contemplate about which rooms they were seen to enter. The food that Tudor servants ate was not the food that appeared on the king's table, and it was not the food that appeared in the Great Hall for the senior household officers, and the differences between these categories were substantial enough to constitute different diets rather than different versions of the same diet. The Eltham Ordinances specified exactly what each grade of servant was entitled to receive, how many dishes, what quality of meat, what quantity of bread and ale, and the specifications descended the hierarchy in a way that tracked political importance rather than nutritional need. Senior officers of the household received multiple meat dishes, fine bread and wine. Lower servants received coarser bread, smaller quantities of meat of lower quality, and ale rather than wine. The children of the kitchen, the lowest grade of kitchen staff, often actual children employed to turn spits and perform the most physically demanding and least skilled kitchen tasks, received the remnants of what the grades above them had not consumed, supplemented by whatever scraps the cook was disposed to provide. This was not considered an injustice. It was considered an appropriate reflection of hierarchy. The ale that lubricated the entire household operation was produced in quantities that suggest the Tudors were either extremely thirsty or extremely aware that the water supply at Hampton Court was not something you wanted to drink without modification. The Palace Brewery produced small ale, a low-alcohol fermented beverage that was consumed throughout the day by servants of every grade, in volumes that the household accounts record with the matter-of-fact precision of a supply chain document, which is effectively what they were. The small ale was safer than the water, which was drawn from sources that received the drainage of a household of over 1,000 people and their horses, and it was consumed in quantities that would today be considered extraordinary for a working day, but that in 1530 was simply what you drank if you were at Hampton Court and wanted to remain hydrated and ambulatory. The ale was not strong enough to produce intoxication in normal consumption. It was simply what there was. The wine was for people above your station, and you knew your station. The political danger of court service is the element that the television versions consistently underplay, perhaps because it is difficult to dramatize a risk that operates through proximity and perception rather than through dramatic confrontation. Working at Hampton Court in 1530 meant existing in the same physical space as the most volatile and consequential political relationships in England. The king's ongoing struggle with the Pope over his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the rising influence of Anne Boleyn and the faction that surrounded her, the declining position of Cardinal Wolsey, who had built Hampton Court and given it to the king, and who would be dead within the year, arrested on charges of treason that reflected his failure to deliver the annulment the king wanted, rather than any treasonous act he had actually committed. These were not abstract political developments happening somewhere else. They were happening in the rooms you worked in, among the people you served, and the choices made by the senior figures of the court about which faction to support, which room to be seen in, and which conversations to have within earshot of which people had consequences that cascaded downward through the household hierarchy in ways that could affect servants who had no political agency whatsoever. Thomas Cromwell, who would replace Wolsey as Henry's chief minister and who would himself be executed in 1540 on charges that reflected the king's displeasure with the Anne of Cleves marriage rather than any actual treasonous conduct, began his career in Wolsey's household. The connection served him well until Wolsey's fall, at which point the connection became a liability that Cromwell managed with considerable political skill by attaching himself to the king's cause in the matter of the annulment. Not everyone in Wolsey's household was as politically adroit. The servants who had built their positions on Wolsey's patronage and who lacked Cromwell's instinct for survival found themselves, in 1530, in a household whose patron had lost the king's favour and whose future was correspondingly uncertain. Court service offered extraordinary rewards to those who navigated it successfully. It offered rather different outcomes to those who did not. The numbers that frame the Tudor court's operation at Hampton Court in 1530 are numbers that the household accounts preserve with the bureaucratic thoroughness that makes the Tudor period unusually well documented for a pre-modern era. The household consumed approximately 1,000 sheep per year, approximately 1,000 oxen, 8,000 deer from the royal parks. The wine cellar held hundreds of barrels of wine imported from France, Spain, and the Rhine, supplemented by the domestic ale production of the Palace brewery. The fuel consumption of the kitchens alone, wood, charcoal and coal for the great fireplaces, was sufficient to heat a substantial town. The wages bill for the household ran to thousands of pounds per year, in an era when a skilled craftsman might earn £15 to £20 annually. The palace was, in economic terms, a significant employer and a significant consumer, a small city whose entire purpose was the support and display of a single person's power and comfort, and whose every function was organized around the requirement that the king should never, at any moment of his day, be inconvenienced by the absence of whatever he required. The sweating sickness, the mysterious epidemic disease that struck England in waves between 1485 and 1551, and that killed with a speed that contemporaries found uniquely terrifying, sometimes within hours of the first symptoms, visited Hampton Court during Henry's reign and carried off members of the court with the impartiality that epidemic disease traditionally shows toward hierarchical distinctions. The sweat, as it was known, killed a gentleman of the bedchamber in the same outbreak that killed a kitchen boy, and it required the king to move between palaces with a speed and frequency that the household had to support under considerable logistical pressure. Moving the court from Hampton Court to another palace meant moving not just the king and his immediate attendants, but the entire household, the kitchen equipment, the furnishings, the administrative records, the horses, the dogs, the hawks, the food stores, and the several hundred people whose jobs required them to be wherever the king was. The Tudor court was not a fixed institution. It was a mobile city that happened to stop at Hampton Court more often than anywhere else, and the servants who constituted it were expected to be mobile with it, on whatever notice the king's health, comfort, or political situation required. To survive your day as a Tudor servant at Hampton Court in 1530, you would have needed to know your station with absolute precision. Which rooms you were permitted to enter, which conversations you were permitted to have, which factions you were permitted to be seen associating with, and which of the several hundred people in the palace it was safe to antagonize and which it was not. You would have needed to perform your specific function with a consistency that gave no one above you in the hierarchy cause to notice you for the wrong reasons, since being noticed for the wrong reasons in Henry's court had a range of consequences that extended considerably beyond the loss of a position. You would have needed to eat the food your station entitled you to without complaint about its quality, drink the ale that was provided, sleep in the accommodation assigned to your grade, and conduct whatever ambitions you possessed with a discretion that made them invisible to anyone who might find them inconvenient. The groom of the stool, attending the king in his most private moments, knew things about the king that no one else knew. The scullion turning the spit in the great kitchen knew nothing about the king, except that the king's meals had to be ready on time and hot when they arrived. Both of them were serving the same person. Both of them were subject to the same volatile political weather. The groom of the stool had influence that the scullion could not imagine, and risks that the scullion would never face. The scullion had an anonymity that protected him from the consequences of proximity in ways that the groom of the stool, standing in the king's bedchamber at 6 in the morning with personal knowledge of the king's moods and habits and digestion, could not afford. Hampton Court in 1530 was a palace of extraordinary beauty, extraordinary food, extraordinary music, and extraordinary political danger, distributed unevenly across a hierarchy of over 1,000 people, most of whom never saw the king, and all of whom were working in their various ways to keep him comfortable. The palace still stands. The hierarchy it housed does not. The records of what it cost to run, in money, in labour, in careers and occasionally in lives, survive in the National Archives, in a series of household account books whose thoroughness is almost touching, given what they were accounting for.